Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. The discussion of our nation's energy infrastructure is very important, and as is the administration's work on the Quadrennial Energy Review. I'm particularly interested in the pipeline safety aspect of it. Over my years on this committee, I have referenced very many times the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969. That oil spill had tremendous local and national ramifications, giving birth to our modern environmental movement in many ways and changing much of the way our nation as a whole has viewed the environment and oil development. Sadly, the Santa Barbara community was recently hit with another terrible oil spill along the coast. On May 19th, more than 100,000 gallons of crude oil spilled from the ruptured Plains All-American pipeline along the treasured Gaviota coast, just north of Santa Barbara. The oil quickly flowed under the highway, onto the beach, and into the ocean, where the oil slick spread south for miles along the coastline. While the exact causes of the spill are still being investigated, it is already clear that woefully inadequate federal pipeline safety standards have played a significant role. It turns out that the Plains All-American Pipeline is the only federally regulated pipeline in Santa Barbara County. It's also the only transmission pipeline in the county that does not have an automatic shutoff valve built into its system, and this is not a coincidence. Every other comparable oil pipeline in Santa Barbara County has an automatic shutoff valve because the county has required it. But the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, as it's called, does not make this requirement of pipeline operators. While an automatic shutoff valve may not have prevented the spill, it certainly could have minimized it. Plains was actually allowed to squirrel away tens of millions of dollars into what they called a contingency fund for when their pipeline would inevitably fail. Yet they weren't even required to spend a fraction of that amount on installing basic spill prevention technologies. This, to me, defies common sense, and it cannot be allowed to continue. And this is just one example of lax safety standards. My constituents are understandably angry, and I share their anger. With all due respect for my seatmate, Mr. Green, who appropriately isn't here right now, oil and gas development at its core is dangerous and dirty business. The mere fact that Plains and other companies have oil spill contingency funds shows that there is no such thing as a safe pipeline. Spills do happen, and they will continue to happen as long as we depend on fossil fuel for our energy needs. We obviously cannot end this dependence overnight, but we clearly need to take bigger and bolder actions to achieve the clean energy future that we all know is needed. Secretary Moniz, I appreciate the President's and your strong commitment to pursuing renewable energy. The objectives of QER are important. We cannot build a clean energy future without modernizing our infrastructure and preparing for new challenges, but we must also do everything in our power to ensure that this infrastructure is as safe as possible. Congress has repeatedly directed PHMSA to strengthen its standards, and yet PHMSA has done very little. The QER specifically mentions a draft PHMSA rule in development that would help strengthen some of these standards. But PHMSA first began taking comment on this rule nearly 5 years ago, and nothing has been published so far. And in 2011, Congress enacted legislation explicitly directing PHMSA to issue a rule requiring automatic shutoff valves on new pipelines by January of last year. Still, not even a proposal, let alone a final rule. I find this really inexcusable. I know DOE does not have direct control over this agency. Transportation does, or rulemaking. But what's the point of replacing aging pipelines and building new ones if they're all built using ineffective and outdated safety standards? The pipeline that burst in my district was not even 30 years old. So age is clearly not the only factor here. So, Mr. Secretary, my question for you, and I'd appreciate if you can get back to me because I've taken most of this time, but what is the administration going to do now to ensure, there's a lot of attention focused on this topic, to ensure that a new pipeline infrastructure is as safe as possible?